And welcome to the Cape Town Press Club at Home, brought to you with the support of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and our technical producer, Magritte Groenewold. We bring you these events free of charge, but that, of course, doesn't mean that they don't cost the club anything. I'd like to thank our members who have made a contribution and ask those who have not yet to please do so. On the 19th of August, I will have a fireside chat with the Setcho Kaganyago, the South African Reserve Bank Governor. But our guest today is André de Ruyter, Group CEO of Eskom. South Africa's seemingly intractable electricity woes have dragged on for over a decade. Load shedding, soaring prices, ballooning debt, which has imperiled the entire country's economy. But in January 2020, André de Ruyter stepped in as Group Chief Executive for Eskom Holdings, facing the daunting task of sorting it all out. In his 30-year career, de Ruyter has occupied various portfolios in the energy sector, including in China and in Germany. Our guest will give us a 20-minute or so presentation, which will be illustrated on how things currently stand. You can ask questions at any stage, but I will move on to these at the end of the presentation. We'll try to fit in as many as time allows. So I'd like to now welcome to our virtual studio, Mr. de Ruyter. Good afternoon,
André. Thank you.
Okay. And I'm going to hand it over to you now for your presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. It's always an honor and a privilege to address such an august audience, and I really appreciate the opportunity of sharing some of the opportunities and challenges that Eskom faces at the moment. So without further ado, let me move straight on into the screen that I want to share. Let me just get there. There we go. Right. Brent, can I just check if everything is fine on your side?
Yes, we can see it quite clearly. Thank you.
Great. All right. So again, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be able to share a couple of thoughts with you on the Eskom turnaround plan as we see it at this point in time. As Brent mentioned in his introduction, we have some very substantial and very challenging issues that we face. There's debt, 450 billion. We have to borrow money to service our debt, so that's clearly not a sustainable business model. We have significant outstanding receivables, mainly from municipalities. The top 20 municipalities now owe us in the order of about 30 billion rand, with no immediate prospect that those debts will be repaid. We've seen substantial increases in our costs. We have seen large increases in our employee costs, but also in the cost of coal, which of course for Eskom is a major cost, about 51% of our total cost. We pay too much for procurement. We have had struggling operations. Our energy availability factor is sitting at around 65%, which is way below where it should be. We've seen load shedding, unfortunately, which is something that is highly regrettable, but obviously is a symptom of the underlying operational instability. We've seen costs increase, revenue lost, and then we've seen some very significant environmental challenges. The business model itself, in our view, is also outdated, and this has led to what some call rather dramatically the utility death spiral. We've experienced operational and structural inefficiencies. We have a business model that is about 97 years old, monolithic, vertically integrated, and that has led to a lack of transparency. And of course, one of the major reasons for the business model becoming outdated is that the energy landscape globally has changed very considerably, in particular with the advent of highly competitive renewable energy sources. Now, in addition to all of these challenges, during March of this year, 4 out of the 11 key risks that Eskom has in its risk register manifested themselves. So we had a significant demand constraint, or supply constraint rather, as a consequence of Unit 1 at Koeberg experiencing an ingress of sea life that led to stage 4 load shedding. So that was a priority 1 supply incident. One could also argue that as a result of the downgrade, not only of the sovereign, but also of Eskom to below investment grade, that we also faced an economic or financial collapse. And certainly the prognosis for a 7% contraction in GDP this year would augur that. Then in addition, we had a catastrophic IT system failure. We had significant challenges around climate change and environmental compliance, as I mentioned. But then very importantly, COVID-19 caused the global pandemic, and that obviously had its impacts on Eskom as well. So we have had just about everything but the kitchen sink thrown at us in terms of risks that manifested themselves. Now, this is a complicated slide, so allow me to just explain this to you. Prior to the lockdown, we had a forecast of what demand would be. And what the green section at the bottom of the graph indicates is the extent to which demand reduced. So if the green section is above the 0 line, then that gives you an indication that demand reduced. And you can see there that we saw a very significant drop-off in demand between 6 to 7 gigawatts reduction during the day, 11 gigawatts lower demand in the mornings. And that led us to have to declare force majeure on some of our wind IPPs. Obviously, the wind in South Africa blows mainly at night, and we really didn't need that electricity, and we were unable to turn down our coal-fired power stations to the extent required. So we had to declare force majeure for those wind IPP suppliers. However, we, in addition to the other challenges that we faced, we then experienced one of the coldest winters in a decade, according to the weather services. And you can see there where the red line dipped below the 0 line. That indicates that our demand exceeded supply. And as a matter of fact, last night was again a very high demand evening, 32,000 megawatts that we had to supply to the South African economy and consumers, and very grateful that we were able to do so without having to resort to load shedding. But we did burn a substantial amount of diesel using our open cycle gas turbines to balance out the peak that occurred at that time. So as you can see from this graph, we've seen a gradual normalization of demand, and we expect, depending on the severity of the lockdown and further government regulations that may be implemented, that we will see a recovery to pre-lockdown levels towards the beginning of September. So we've got about a month left to go. Now, we try to find the opportunities within the lockdown period to increase our short-term maintenance, especially to address known issues that gave rise to partial load losses. And we were able to recover about 2,000 megawatts of these partial load losses. We doubled our maintenance during the first number of weeks when demand was really low, to just under 10,000 megawatts of capacity that we were able to maintain. And that's a significant increase, more than 1.5 times the normal average. The downside of that is that the major maintenance programs that require us to take down units for a number of months at a time had to be deferred due to lockdown restrictions. It's medically inadvisable to congregate large numbers of employers and contractors on a single site. So that program has had to be moved out. And fortunately, we were able to reduce our partial load losses significantly, almost halve them. And that has led to an improvement in our available capacity. We've had a very firm commitment program in place. But we still were not able to achieve our P80 scenario of limiting load shedding to only 3 days of stage 1 load shedding, but we had to impose 7 consecutive days of load shedding, varying between stage 1 and stage 2. And that is a reflection of the reality of a generation system that is unreliable and unpredictable due to the fact of maintenance having been deferred over a number of years. Now, when you defer maintenance, you borrow from the future at an extortionate interest rate. And unfortunately, this is the situation that Eskom finds itself in right now, where the cost and complexity of catching up with the deferred maintenance significantly exceeds what it would have been if we had done the maintenance over the past decade or so as was required. And one of the major factors that we did not do was to conduct our midlife refurbishments, which are a key element in extending the life of our power stations. And that has also contributed substantially to this lack of reliability. Now, we've launched this reliability maintenance recovery project, and we aim to improve our energy availability factor to 70% during the current year. So you can see there's a substantial improvement from the 65% that we had during the past financial year. We are currently sitting at a smidgen under that 70% target, so we have made good progress. We have to save cost. Cost is a major issue that we have to drive. We need to perform this midlife refurbishments that got postponed and reset our maintenance programs. And this requires a reset not only of how we do maintenance, but also in our own mindset, that we take a deliberate and conscious decision to steer away from firefighting mode into doing scheduled, regular, consistent maintenance in order to improve the reliability of our system. And that requires a major intervention, and we have been very busy during this lockdown period to put that in place. So let's take a bit of a look at what the system is expected to do. As you can see there, the black line on the chart indicates when we are going to be burning gas, and gas is that that's the diesel. That's the pink line there, the pink shaded section. And the operating reserve is the reserve that we have to maintain in order to prevent a national blackout. So when this reserve becomes too small, that is when we have to take the decision to implement load shedding. And this is really an extraordinary measure in order to prevent the entire national grid from collapsing. And that's obviously a catastrophic outcome that we have to avoid. So load shedding is the lever that we use to prevent that. Just as an aside, clearly the load shedding is very different to the load reduction. Load reduction is something that we implement at a local level to prevent the overloading of our local distribution networks, particularly in areas that are very prone to illegal connections and overloadings, which leads to the blowing of transformers, the exploding of transformers, apart from the significant safety risks, which sadly have led to a number of electrocutions, particularly of children, which of course is very, very sad and something that should be avoided at all costs. Now, if we implement successfully the reliability maintenance program, you can see that we steadily start decreasing our use of diesel, and we start using diesel as a peak shaving mechanism only. So it only operates during peak hours. And this requires that we address our available capacity, which we will add by means of this reliability maintenance program. And you can see that this darker blue sliver increases in size as we progress. And that means that if we are successful, and we're working very hard to ensure that we are successful, that this will lead to a decrease in load shedding going forward. I have to stress, because South Africans always remember the most optimistic forecast and never remember the risks that are pointed out. I have to stress that this is what we aspire to achieve, but there are many, many moving parts to get into place at the right time in order to minimize the risk of load shedding going forward. So I have to stress that until such time as this program is completed by around about September of next year, that there will be a residual risk of load shedding as we conduct this maintenance program that unfortunately cannot entirely be avoided. There is this risk that will remain. We are working hard to avoid it, but given where we are with our generation system, this is a risk that we have to manage and mitigate. Now, one of the major levers that we've got to pull in order to reduce the risk of load shedding is, of course, the increased and improved performance of our so-called new build projects. And these are the mega projects at Medupi, Kusile, and Ngula. We've been able to repair Unit 3 during a 75-day outage. We made certain modifications to the boiler plant. This was completed on time and within budget. We immediately proceeded to implement the same changes on Unit 6. Unit 4 and 2 will also be taken off. Unit 4 has been taken off and is currently subject to these repairs, and Unit 2 will follow in due course during this month. And once that is done, we believe that we will have a substantially improved availability out of our Medupi power station. However, we still need to test all of these modifications. So there is a comprehensive testing program on Unit 3 to tell our engineers whether or not the changes have been successful, but so far so good. The prognosis is quite positive. We are then in a position to roll out the same modifications at Kusile. That will start in the first quarter of next year. We have had to suspend construction on Kusile 4 to 6 due to the COVID-19 lockdown. That's since been lifted, and we, over the past month, have been able to recommence the construction activities, but it has been a very, very challenging exercise with a significant degree of attention having to be paid to safety and also to prevent any spread of infection. Once we have successfully commissioned Kusile Unit 2 and 3, we will be able to put these into commercial operation from quarter 2 of FY21. So that means in the second half of the next calendar year, and that will make a big difference in order to enable us to keep the grid supplied. However, having said all of this, at Eskom we believe that it is imperative that we add generation capacity to the grid to supplement the older units that are going to be put into retirement in accordance with IRP 19 over the next decade. We'll be taking off some 8,000 to 12,000 megawatts. Of course, this is not a binary situation. You don't take off 8,000 megawatts the one day and have 8,000 megawatts online the next day. So there's a lot of careful planning and scheduling that have to go into coordinating the availability of additional capacity, and that's part of what our restructuring program is also about. Ngula also had its share of design defects, but happy to report that these have now been fixed. Now, clearly, if we stay where we are, we will go out of business. And at the end of the day, one's got to remember that Eskom is a business. It has to make a profit. It has to pay its costs. It has to continue to grow to meet demand. It has to continue to invest. So where we were simply did not pose a viable strategic option for us. So we've identified 5 major strategic areas of attention: operational stability, improve the income statement, address the balance sheet, to continue decisively towards restructuring with the divisionalization program as a first step, and then lastly, but very importantly, improve the culture and management of our people who make Eskom have such a great potential as an organization. So in terms of operational stability, I've referenced reliability maintenance. We want to avoid load shedding. This is not something that we do lightly. I'm personally involved in every decision to impose load shedding, and I can assure you that it's a decision that we take as a last resort, having regard to the need to protect the national grid. We are looking at coal, not only looking at stabilizing the supply of coal, but also the quality of coal. We are looking at the new builds. We are managing the demand side much better. I think that we are extremely grateful for the cooperation and support that we get from the South African public when we put up those power alerts on national television. There's a real and noticeable difference when we put those power alerts forward, and that's a great national collaboration to achieve an issue of national importance. So we're very grateful for that. We're making some progress, good progress, on addressing our environmental issues. We're aware that the old power stations that were built in a time when environmental regulation was a lot less stringent than it is today is not where we can continue to operate. So we are taking down units and making the investments. We're also buying in more power. We have a number of short-term power purchase programs on the go, and we think that depending on the price range, we'll probably get between 50 and possibly up to 100 megawatts on that. The bids for that program are currently being assessed, so we don't know what the answers are yet. We've also launched a rejuvenation of our enterprise resource planning system, SAP. This is a very important tool for governance and also for planning and running our maintenance programs. This was sadly neglected, so that's got to be fixed. Our IT system needs an entire overhaul. We need to look at the rest of our value chain, transmission and distribution. And then quite excitingly, we are looking at repurposing some of our older power stations in order to drive a just energy transition so that we do not leave those communities that have invested generations in coal and the generation of electricity from coal in the lurch, but that we enable them to also benefit from transitioning to newer and greener forms of energy. We are making good progress on developing the single market operator and single buyer. We are working on ways to expedite that and accelerate that. We view that as a key lever in enabling new private investment to come in to fill the generation gap that will increasingly develop as we put the older power stations into retirement. We're a business, so we need to look at our income statement. First of all, again, we want to avoid load shedding, because if we do load shedding, then obviously we don't generate profit. We need to expand our margin, and we have made good progress in resolving a number of the NERSA tariff disputes. We need to resolve municipal debt, and you will have seen that of late we have taken a significantly more assertive approach to managing municipal debt. This is a tough one, but I'm very happy to report that we've got full political support, particularly from the Deputy President, who leads the political task team charged with assisting Eskom. So that has been very useful to get that political backing. We're renegotiating coal contracts that we believe are excessively priced. In fact, there's only one coal contract that is a long-term contract, 10 years left to run. We're addressing fuel oil. That's a major cost item for us. There's been some news flow on that. By avoiding load shedding, getting a more reliable system, we can reduce the consumption of diesel. We burn between 3.5 and 4.5 billion rand of diesel per annum, so a major opportunity for us to save cost. We've reduced our headcount by means of a voluntary severance program. We're looking at debt service cost opportunities, very careful not to use the word debt restructuring. That is not what we're doing. We are looking at, as our debt matures, how we can reduce the cost of debt. We are participating with the DMRE and looking at how we can reduce the cost of IPP electricity. I mentioned the SAP program. We've got a significant program looking at spares. To put that into perspective, you might think spares is not a big thing in our lives, but we've got between 1.3 and 1.7 billion rands worth of spares at every power station. So that translates into about 24 billion rands worth of spares in total, just in generation. And we think there's about 10% of that we can seek to convert into cash. We're trying our best to improve procurement by doing something called price check and by cataloging our spares, but then also managing our employee benefit costs. That's a segue to get us into the strong balance sheet. We have cut our capex very severely from 38 billion rand to 20 billion. We need to do this without impacting our operational reliability, but that means that we have to scrub our capex. We are looking at opportunities to work closely with the Department of Environmental Affairs, Forestry and Fisheries to schedule as appropriate our environmental capex. With the power station that's got 2 to 3 years left to run, it makes little economic sense to invest billions in becoming compliant only upon completion of the project to then decommission that power station. I mentioned working capital management. That's a key area for us, and working on making sure that we can use the older power stations that currently are in fact a liability for Eskom because they require significant provisions for decommissioning, to convert those into assets that we can use to support as part of a repurposing exercise, the just energy transition. Restructuring. The news flow has been that we are going slow on restructuring. Nothing is further from the truth. We are divisionalizing. We've got the 3 divisional boards set up with delegated authorities. The business models are being run. We're working on our IT systems. We have relinked. Relinked means that we've transferred them out of the head office back into the businesses, some 9,000 members of staff. We're finalizing the financial statements, and we are looking at non-core assets, improving those and optimizing those, selling some businesses. We've got a major property portfolio that we are looking at disposing, so you can expect some further news flow in that regard, rationalizing that portfolio. And then we have clarified the end state, which is in accordance with the Department of Public Enterprises document on the restructured electricity industry in South Africa. And as I mentioned, we are exploring, in consultation with our shareholder, ways of accelerating the restructuring, because we think that this is a key element to enabling further investment in generation capacity in South Africa. Lastly, culture and people. We have resuscitated our values. Our number one corporate value is safety. So a lot of attention is going into making sure that we can work safely, but also that we act responsibly towards the environment in so much as we can, given our very large environmental footprint. But one of our values is also integrity, and revitalizing that value is obviously very important as we seek to recover money unlawfully paid to former employees and others, and you will have seen summons being issued in that regard. We're trying to drive urgency in the organization. We're trying to create a high-performance culture through a production bonus, which is self-funding. And just to make sure that everybody understands, executives do not qualify for the production bonus. This is aimed at shop floor workers, and it is generated from savings as a result of better production on the ground. Obviously, as we produce better results from our coal-fired power stations, we will burn less diesel, and that's the major source of the funding for this production bonus. We've also introduced forced ranking for our top echelons, and that will be used to determine pay increases. Visible felt leadership has been made a bit of a challenge by the pandemic. It's not so easy to move around power stations, but we have paid a number of visits to power stations, and we are in the final throes of filling all the vacancies. And then we've got a management team that we believe can drive this program. Just a couple of quick words on the changing nature of the energy landscape that we operate in. More and more financial institutions are indicating that they are moving away from funding and even insurance for fossil fuels. You can see there that at the end of 2018, 415 global investors managing some $32 trillion called for a complete thermal coal phase out by 2030. BlackRock withdrew from coal. EIB and KfW, who are major developmental financing institutions, they will no longer fund any fossil-based projects, and local banks have also taken this stance. So this is something that we've taken note of, and we obviously have an opportunity here to drive a greener, cleaner Eskom going forward. First of all, I think it's important to point out that we are not climate change denialists. We accept and we understand that it also poses a risk to Eskom, but also to the economy of South Africa, and we therefore have to play our part. There's an interesting graph there where you can see that the levelized cost of various forms of energy, and this yellow line is for our own 100 megawatt Sierra wind farm, and you can see there the cost competitiveness depending on the load factor. A very, very favorable equation indeed, which makes us quite optimistic that renewable energy can be cost competitive. The latest bid round for photovoltaic energy in Abu Dhabi came in at 1.35 American cents per kilowatt hour, which is an astonishingly low number and is indicative of the continued learning curve that applies to this new technology. So we have set up, I think we're the first business in South Africa to do so, a Just Energy Transition Office led by a senior manager, and we are engaging with a number of stakeholders. We are developing a business plan. We are making sure that we can play a leading role in enabling this transition to also take advantage of the lower cost of electricity opportunity that is being offered by these new technologies. We think that it will bring about a number of major benefits, reduction in emissions. We think that if properly supported by an appropriate industrial policy, that it can assist local manufacturing, which will drive job creation, and that it will enable us to comply with our international agreements, hopefully attract greater foreign direct investment, and then ultimately create growth opportunities for the economy. Now, this may sound like wishful thinking and it may sound aspirational, but I have to say that the conversations that we've been having with lenders have been immensely encouraging, and there is a lot of support for this type of transaction and offering some form of discounted or preferential financing to support this, the so-called green energy, which is a narrative that we believe could be of great interest, not only for Eskom, but also for South Africa. So yes, Eskom has major challenges. We need to respond with a short-term plan, but also enable Eskom to develop and evolve into an entity that can continue to be a supplier of electricity to South Africa. We have decided to restructure ourselves, and we are accelerating that process, and we want to be responsive and to take advantage of the changing energy landscape to drive this just energy transition, which we believe offers a great opportunity for us as Eskom to participate in creating a much needed stimulus for the South African economy. So with that, I just have to put in this plug for managing your electricity at home responsibly. We would appreciate your continued support in helping us to avoid load shedding, particularly when it's very cold. Please switch off those non-essential appliances and help us to avoid load shedding. Thank you very much.
Thank you, André, for that thorough presentation. We've got a lot of questions. I think some of them you may have partly addressed already in your presentations. I just want to jump in with Coburg. You mentioned sort of was a priority one sort of incident there. Are you assuring the public that Coburg is still well managed, well run, and safe?
Absolutely. You know, the slowdown on maintenance that characterized our fossil fuel stations did not happen at Coburg, and that is because it is a highly regulated plant, a lot of oversight, not only locally but also from the International Energy Agency. We are a member of a number of international associations that help us with oversight, and I'm very confident that Coburg is far and away our best maintained power station, and that the nuclear risk itself is infinitesimally low. What happened was that we lost a unit due to, as I said, the increase of sea life. So this is not, it's something that has happened in the past, but at no stage was there ever any risk of a nuclear incident of any nature whatsoever.
Right. Okay. Lindsay Dentlinger, ENCA, is asking, how realistic is it, and is it worth the legal costs for Eskom to pursue former executives to recover the 3 billion from them, as summonses issued last week?
We are working with, amongst others, the asset forfeiture unit, as well as our own legal advisors, to prepare what are known as anti-dissipation orders. And that tries to prevent people from spending ill-gotten gains before we can recover them. So we are trying to preserve as much as possible. Will we be able to reclaim or recover all of the 3 billion? Probably not. I suspect a significant amount of money has already been spent. But on the other hand, can we afford to sit back as South Africans and say, it's okay, we are going to let you walk away with the money because we don't want to spend money on lawyers? I think there's also a matter of principle at stake here that we have to pursue. And I'm quite confident, based on advice that we received from our lawyers, that we've got a good case and a strong case.
Good. Lami's Omaji is asking, is it economically viable to finish the last few units of Kusile? And I noticed you talked about the cost of coal and how the whole world is going against that. And we also had a comment from David Lipschitz saying that Eskom has proven it's not very good at building power stations with the cost overruns and the long time it takes. Answer to Lami's?
Yeah, I think, Lamis, you are, we are at the point where the last units at Kusile are between 96 and 99% complete. To not spend the last bit of money now to bring them onto the grid will result in an extraordinary loss of money. Were they overspent? Should Eskom have done the project better? Absolutely, we should have. But that's where we are now, and now we need to get them finished and put that electricity onto the grid in order to protect the economy.
Donald Presley is asking about whether you support semi-privatization of elements of Eskom.
I think the most important thing that Eskom can do to encourage private investment is to restructure ourselves, and in so doing, allow private investment to take place, particularly in generation. We believe that this is an easier way of private sector involvement than trying to sell shares in an entity that has 450 billion rands worth of debt. That would be quite a challenging exercise. So it's a policy question. It is not for us to decide, but we think that private sector participation is probably best done in the generation sector.
Yeah, and perhaps related is Carol Payton's question: how urgent is it to restructure Eskom's balance sheet? Is Eskom comfortable carrying this amount of debt? The bigger picture of the state taking 250 billion of Eskom debt seems to have receded. And then she also added on, when you say you're looking at lowering the cost of the debt without restructuring, is that what you're considering?
Well, it's one of the levers. I don't think there is any one silver bullet here to take care of 450 billion rands worth of debt. We need to address the cost of our debt. We need to address our cost base in order to free up more cash to pay down debt. We are very grateful for the continued equity support that we are getting from National Treasury. So that is very useful, and that is why the recent court verdict around the equity injection not being treated as revenue is so critically important for the restructuring. That means that we are able to get that 69 billion rands worth of equity injection into Eskom. So that is immensely important. But the debt doesn't go away by itself. And that is the important message, that this is still a conundrum that needs to be resolved. And it's more than an Eskom issue. It is a national issue that we need to address. We are doing what we can within our remit and within our powers, but ultimately it is a shareholder, a government, and a public issue that needs to be addressed.
Well, Anton Erbart is asking, when will an independent transmission system and market operator be legally unbundled? And why in your presentation to Parliament did you indicate that this is delayed by 2 years? And we've had related questions about this restructuring. Are you in favor of breaking up Eskom into 3 different entities?
Well, we are already making very good progress along the road to legally separating Eskom into those 3 subsidiaries, generation, transmission, and distribution. So I think that that is happening. To answer Professor Eberhard's question, I think that what we've done is to very carefully map out on a proper Gantt chart, as good engineers will do, all of the various activities that have to take place in order to legally separate the transmission entity and also the system and market operator. And given the fact that there are a number of regulatory and legislative decisions that have to be made by inter alia NERSA, the Republic of Mineral Resources and Energy, over which we have no control, the answer came back 2 years. But I can give Professor Eberhard the assurance that we're working very hard to come up with an alternative plan to expedite, achieve essentially the same objective. This is still subject to board approval, but we are putting together a plan and a proposal that we intend to put to our board and our shareholders soon that will pull back that 2-year timeline that we communicated and achieve this objective in a shorter period of time.
Okay. Then we've got a question from Aaron Hyman. Is there any prospect of Eskom? Sorry, that's not the one I want. I want the one is, how is Eskom reconciling with labor unions about the inevitable shift towards renewables and the prospects of job losses in the coal mining sector? Are they on board with REIPP, which I think is independent producers?
Renewable,
right?
yeah. REIPPs stands for Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers, which is quite a mouthful. But yes, we keep on having discussions with our labor unions, and this is part of the reason why the transition has to be just. If we do not provide labor and also the communities in which our workforce and also the workforce, frankly, that are occupied in coal mining, if we do not present them with a meaningful future which creates opportunities for them, then why on earth will they support a transition to renewable energy? So we absolutely have to, not only from a moral perspective, but also from an economic and a political perspective, create an alternative future that involves those communities and those workers and gives them a reason to want to participate in the transition. Otherwise, it will be a very hard sell to persuade them.
Okay. Clive Keegan asked, municipal debt to Eskom has reached an alarming level and the courts have frustrated every attempt to implement revenue control measures. What steps are you contemplating to tackle this growing crisis? And perhaps I can just jump in there. What about the Soweto debt, which, if I'm not mistaken, combined is probably more than all the other municipalities put together owe? So it's around 8 billion?
No, the total municipal debt is currently sitting at about 30 billion. And the total Soweto debt is in the order of about 12 billion. That does not make the Soweto debt an insignificant amount of money. 12 billion rand is still an enormous amount of money. But the steps that we're taking, first of all, with regard to the municipalities, is that we are increasingly going to the courts to obtain attachment orders and writs of execution. So in the case of Mfuleni, we have dispatched the sheriff court to attach movable assets. The sheriff went in with his team and collected the assets and removed them and parked them, obviously at a later stage to have a sale and execution. That clearly got the attention of the municipality, and we are now engaged in negotiations to settle a payment plan. Similarly, with our biggest municipal debtor, Maluti Apufong, which is inter alia Harry Smith, that municipality owes us about 5.3 billion, and there we attached a bank account to the tune of some 224 million rand. We subsequently released an amount of some 90 million rand back to the municipality in order to allow them to pay salaries, but also to take steps to prevent the spread of COVID. So we are trying to act responsibly, but the municipal issue is a really substantial challenge that we have to come to grips with, and it relates to a very large extent to the capacity within municipalities to collect debts, to ensure that meters are read, to invoice, to bill, to collect, to enforce. And these practices and these mechanisms very often aren't properly in place in the defaulting municipalities. So we are working with the provinces, we are working with COGTA. It is one of the key focus areas of the political task team dealing with Eskom. And there was a recent announcement again by the Deputy President saying, you know, municipalities have to pay what is due to Eskom. So we believe that with the necessary political will, this problem can be resolved in time, but there is a lot more work that needs to be done.
Well, related to that, Donald Presley is wondering, and there's a presumption in his question, but he's wondering whether you shouldn't take back the distribution from the municipalities, and is implying that that would cut costs.
One of the major revenue generators for many municipalities, in fact, I suspect all of them, is to add a significant markup to electricity bought wholesale from Eskom and then distributed by the municipality. And that partly gives rise to the narrative that electricity in South Africa is expensive. If you look at the markups that municipalities apply to electricity bought from Eskom, it ranges between about 17%, which is the Nelson Mandela Metro, to the highest is the Salt Lake municipality, which adds a markup of 84%. So that's a very, very hefty markup. So if you operate a factory in Salt Lake, which is Kimberley, you will no doubt be of the view that your electricity is terribly expensive, but that is not due to Eskom. Eskom's electricity is, and we've done the benchmarking on this, is amongst the cheapest in the world, certainly compared to developed countries, but also compared to countries north of us. So yes, it is an option, but of course we also have to enable municipalities to be sustainable entities going forward, and depriving them of the revenue that they collect from distributing electricity is going to be something that is a big challenge for them in terms of their revenue base going forward. So one's got to come up with something that works for all stakeholders.
Yes, well, I put in a prepaid meter voluntarily, thinking that make me more aware of my consumption, which it has certainly done, although I don't like paying 170 Rand a month just for having it without using any electricity. But a harder question for you, and that is, what is happening with those secret contracts where we were supplying electricity to people like the aluminium smelters at like half the cost of production? Are we still sitting with those contracts? Is Eskom still bound by them? Some of them had very long lives. So how are we dealing with that?
Yeah, we've got a very intricate relationship with the aluminium smelters. On the one hand, the aluminium smelters do get the benefit of low-cost electricity. On the other hand, they are interruptible customers. So when the system is under strain, we are able to take down some of their pot lines, and that gives us additional capacity in the system. So that's the one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is that the South 32 smelter in Richards Bay is a key element of our so-called black start capability. So if for whatever reason there ever were to be a total collapse of the national grid, we would start up the system by using the Drakensberg pump storage scheme and then using the South 32 facility as one of the first base loads that we would bring back online in order to start stabilizing the system. So it is a very intricate two-way street of give and take between the two industries. And of course, on the other side of the coin, they're also a supplier of coal to Eskom. So that makes it an even more challenging and interesting relationship. We are at the moment looking towards NERSA for a decision on the electricity tariffs, and that is currently in NERSA's domain, and they probably will make a decision within the next 6 months on that particular element.
When you do load shed something like the smelter or one of the other industries, are you still having to compensate them for that?
No. So when we and the terminology is we throw a pot line. So when we shed a pot line, that is part of the contract that they are an interruptible off-taker. Now, we can only do it for a certain period of time. Otherwise, the aluminium solidifies in the pot, which obviously is a very negative outcome. But for a certain period of time, we are able to shed that line, and that particularly during peak hours gives us significant additional flexibility.
Okay. And then I think we have a question which many people watching will want the answer to, from Lindsay Dentlinger again at ENCA. What is the outlook for load shedding in the remaining weeks of winter, and with the expectations of an uptick in the economy in September?
So again, it's likely that we will have increased load shedding going forward. I think that there is a risk of load shedding always in the system, given the lack of predictability, the lack of reliability due to maintenance that was not done. This risk will over time diminish as we carry out the midlife refurbishments, as I indicated on that colorful slide with the choppy black line on it. And that, I think, is why we need to do this maintenance. Now, while we carry out the maintenance, as I've said consistently since I started in January of this year, there is going to be an increased risk of load shedding because we have to take down these units in order to perform the maintenance. If we do not take down the units and do the maintenance, the risk of significantly worse load shedding is simply going to increase. So we've come at a point where the decision now is we have to take down the units and do the load shedding. We simply don't have alternatives. So, Lindsay, unfortunately, there is an increased risk. We are trying to mitigate it as best we can. We are doing quite well in terms of managing peaks right now. I mentioned the 32,000 megawatts that we were able to navigate last night, albeit by using significant numbers of OCGTs. And let's see, we are really doing our best here to keep the lights on, but not at the expense of doing our maintenance.
Well, thank you very much, André de Ruyter, Eskom CEO, speaking to us today. We know that you're one of the busiest men in the country, so we won't keep you any longer. And we all wish you well in our own self-interests.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you. Goodbye.